It was Christmas Eve, the kind that smells of cinnamon and fake cheer. My daughter-in-law, Emily, stood by the tree handing out gifts, her red lipstick matching the ribbons. "Everyone's getting something small this year," she said brightly. Her parents unwrapped brand new smartphones, smiling like they'd won the lottery. When it was my turn, she passed me a tiny bag. Inside was a pair of gray socks, still with the price tag on. Everyone laughed politely. I laughed too. That's what mothers do, isn't it? Smile, swallow, pretend it doesn't sting. But that night, when the house went quiet and the twinkling lights reflected in my empty teacup, I opened my laptop. One click took me to the insurance portal, the plan I'd been paying for every month for my son, his wife, their children, and her parents. By morning, their names were gone. They thought the story ended there, a petty act of revenge from a hurt old woman. But what followed was so much bigger: a lawsuit, a public scandal, a truth no one saw coming. If you think this is just about a pair of socks, stay with me. You have no idea what came next. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 64 years old, a retired nurse, and a widow for almost 5 years now. I live alone in a small house on the outskirts of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a quiet place where the sound of the wind through the pine trees is sometimes the only company I have. Most days, I don't mind the silence. I fill it with the smell of bread, baking, the ticking of the old clock, and memories that visit like soft ghosts. But that Christmas Eve, the silence on my drive home would feel heavier than it ever had before. I remember that evening so clearly, it almost aches. The sky was already dark by the time I reached David and Emily's house. The windows glowed gold, and from the driveway I could hear the muffled sound of Christmas music and laughter. It was the kind of scene that should warm a mother's heart. I carried my homemade apple pie carefully in both hands, the crust still warm, the scent of cinnamon rising like comfort. I had baked it that morning. David used to say it was his favorite when he was little. When Emily opened the door, she smiled, that quick, polite smile she always wore for me. "Oh, Margaret, you didn't have to bring anything," she said, stepping aside so I could enter. "I thought the kids might like some pie," I said softly. She took the pie, glancing at it for half a second before setting it on the kitchen counter beside several store-bought desserts. "We already have dessert, but thank you," she said, her voice cheerful, dismissive. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, something sharp and expensive, and told myself not to feel small. The house was beautifully decorated, I'll give her that. A tall Christmas tree stood by the fireplace, draped with golden ribbons and ornaments that all matched in color, not like the messy mix of homemade ones I used to hang with David when he was young. The fire crackled, and the children, Evan and Lily, 7 and 9, were running around in matching pajamas, their laughter ringing through the room. David came out of the kitchen just then, looking tired but happy. "Mom, hey," he said, hugging me briefly. He smelled of aftershave and wine. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, holding on to that moment a little longer than he did. We sat down to dinner, and for a while everything was pleasant enough. Emily's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, were there too, always perfectly dressed, always sitting close together like they owned the air in the room. Conversations swirled around me, polite and shallow. I nodded when spoken to, laughed at the right moments, and tried to push away the feeling that I was just an extra at someone else's celebration. After dinner, Emily clapped her hands. "Okay, everyone, time for gifts," she said brightly. The kids squealed and ran to the tree. Emily began handing out packages, her voice sweet and cheerful, her every move perfectly arranged. "Now remember," she said, looking around the room, "we agreed this year everyone gets just something small." I smiled, thinking that sounded fair. I didn't expect much. I never did. The first gifts went to her parents. She handed them each a box wrapped in silver paper. Just something practical, she said, winking. They opened them together, and the gleam of new iPhones filled the room with gasps and laughter. "Oh, Emily." "You shouldn't have," Mrs. Miller exclaimed, though she was already turning the phone over in her hands, admiring it like a trophy. Emily smiled modestly. "Well, it's nothing fancy. Just thought you could use an upgrade." I felt a pinch in my chest, but I brushed it off. Maybe she'd saved up. Maybe she'd found a good deal. Then she turned to me. "And for you, Margaret," she said, picking up a small paper bag. "Just something small for everyone. Remember, I took the bag, careful not to let my fingers shake." Inside was a pair of gray socks, plain thin still with the store tag dangling. "Oh," I said, forcing a smile, "how thoughtful." "They're really soft," Emily added quickly, her eyes darting toward David as if to check whether he'd noticed. He didn't look up. He was busy helping the kids tear through their wrapping paper. I held the socks in my lap, the laughter around me growing louder, fading farther away. The room felt warm, too warm, and I suddenly wanted to leave. But I smiled. I thanked her. I did what mothers do. We hold our pain quietly because making others uncomfortable always feels worse. When the chaos settled, I slipped into the kitchen to wash a few dishes, hoping for a moment of calm. The apple pie I'd brought still sat untouched on the counter, pushed behind a tower of cupcakes. I looked at it then, at the people in the next room. My family, my son, my grandchildren, my daughter-in-law laughing around a tree that had no room for me beneath it. I thought of the insurance plan I'd been paying every month, over $800, to make sure David's family, his children, his wife, even her parents had full coverage. I had told myself it was love, not obligation. But standing there listening to their laughter, I wondered when exactly love had turned into debt. When it was finally time to leave, David hugged me again, a quick squeeze distracted. Emily waved from the doorway. "Drive safe, Margaret." "Merry Christmas." I stepped into the cold night, my breath clouding in front of me. The snow crunched under my boots. Inside the car, the world felt quiet again, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest. The pair of gray socks lay on the passenger seat beside me, folded neatly, untouched. The headlights cut through the dark as I started the engine. The streets were empty, the houses glowing faintly with warmth I couldn't feel. I looked at the socks again and whispered into the stillness, "How long have I been invisible?" And though I didn't know it yet, that was the moment. Something inside me shifted, something small like the sound of a thread finally snapping. When I got home that night, the house felt colder than usual. The heater hummed softly, but it couldn't chase away the kind of chill that comes from the inside out. I set my purse down, took off my coat, and placed the little paper bag on the kitchen table. The socks were still folded neatly inside pale gray, under the yellow light. For a long while, I just stared at them, as if they might explain something to me, why it hurt so much, why being forgotten could feel like betrayal. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. It was just after midnight. I made myself a cup of tea, though I didn't really want it. The steam fogged my glasses, and when I took them off to wipe them, I saw the envelope beside the teacup, my December health insurance bill. $847.50, due in 2 days. I unfolded it carefully, reading the familiar breakdown: primary member, Margaret Collins; dependents, David Collins, Emily Collins, Evan Collins, Lily Collins, 4 names under mine. 4 people who had never once thanked me for keeping them covered. I used to tell myself it was love. That's what mothers do, help their children no matter what. But as I sat there staring at the numbers, the thought came uninvited. Love shouldn't feel like a monthly bill. I remembered the beginning back in 2022 when David lost his job. It had been a terrible time. The pandemic had shaken everything. He called me embarrassed, saying they couldn't afford their health insurance anymore. Without hesitation, I told him I'd add them to my retiree plan from the hospital. Just until things settle, I said. Emily had been on the phone too. She promised they'd contribute half each month. I even remember her exact words. "We'll make it work together, Margaret." Your family, I believed her. For 3 years, I believed her. Every month, I paid the bill. Every time I saw her carrying a new designer bag or posting vacation pictures online, I reminded myself, she'll pay me back eventually. But sitting there that night, I realized I'd never once received a payment. Not one. I opened my old laptop, its fan whirring like a tired breath, and started checking. My email records went back years, thousands of messages, reminders, statements, notes from the insurance company. I searched for Emily. Dozens of emails popped up, but none about money. I searched for transfer payment reimbursement. Nothing. My fingers trembled a little, not from anger yet, but from something sharper, disbelief turning into clarity. Then I saw it. A message from the insurance provider, dated March 3rd, 2023. Dear Mrs. Collins, this is to confirm your plan renewal for the 2023-2024 term. We received your signed authorization form on February 25th. Only I didn't remember signing anything in February. My heart gave a slow, heavy thud. I clicked on the attached form. And there it was, my name scrawled across the bottom, but not in my handwriting. I stared at it, at the awkward curve of the G in Margaret, the shaky line of the L in Collins. Emily had signed it. My daughter-in-law had forged my signature. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the money, though, that mattered. It was the realization that she had crossed a line I didn't even know existed between us. I had thought I was being a good mother, a generous grandmother doing what family does. But in that moment, it hit me I wasn't a mother to her at all. I was a resource, something to be tapped until empty. An ATM with a heartbeat. The house seemed even quieter than the kind of silence that hums in your ears. I closed the laptop and rubbed my hands together for warmth. The tea had gone cold. I could hear the wind outside brushing against the window, soft but insistent, like it wanted to come in and see what I would do next. I turned the laptop back on. The glow of the screen filled the room. I typed in the insurance company's website and logged into my account. There it was, all of it. The names, the coverage details, the dependents. David Collins, spouse. Children, extended family coverage. I stared at it until the words blurred. The cursor hovered near a small blue link, remove dependents. Just 2 words. So easy to click, so impossible to undo. I thought of David, of his tired eyes and distracted hug that night. I thought of Emily smiling in that perfect way of hers as she handed me the socks. I thought of the kids laughing under the Christmas tree. My hand moved closer to the trackpad. I could feel my pulse in my fingers. For years, I told myself that forgiveness was strength, that giving more was proof of love. But maybe that was just something women my age were taught to believe to keep giving until there's nothing left, and then call it virtue. The cursor blinked over the link like a heartbeat. My breath caught in my throat. I placed my finger on the trackpad, ready to click. And then I stopped. Not because I changed my mind, but because I wanted to feel the weight of this moment, to know exactly what it felt like to stand on the edge of saying enough. I sat there, hand trembling slightly, the house utterly still, the screen glowing in the dark. The cursor stayed where it was waiting. So did I. At some point, the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound left in the room. I must have fallen asleep at the table because when I opened my eyes again, the pale morning light was seeping through the curtains. My neck ached and my tea had gone stone cold. The laptop screen had gone dark, but I could still see the faint reflection of my face, tired, older than I remembered, but calm, strangely calm. For the first time in a long while, I felt the stillness of a decision beginning to take shape. I made myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat back down. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that asks you what you're going to do next. I turned the laptop on again, the login screen glowing softly in the morning light. My finger hovered over the touchpad one more time. I could click remove dependence right there and then, but somehow it felt too small for the weight it carried. I wanted to say it out loud to make it real, to hear the sound of my own voice reclaiming something I had lost. I picked up the phone and called the insurance company. A woman answered, cheerful and professional. "Good morning, this is Karen from Member Services. How can I help you today?" I took a breath. "Good morning," I said. "My name is Margaret Collins. I'd like to remove my dependents from my plan effective January 1st. There was a pause just long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. "Of course, Mrs. Collins. May I ask for the reason for removal?" I smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. "They're adults now," I said evenly. "They should have their own plan." She typed something. I could hear the faint clicking of her keyboard through the receiver. "Understood," she said. "We'll send you a confirmation email shortly. The change will take effect on January 1st, and your new premium will reflect the adjustment. Is there anything else I can help you with?" I shook my head, even though she couldn't see that either. "No, thank you. That's all." When I hung up, the silence settled over me again, but this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The kind of silence that comes after you've finally said what needed to be said. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. My hands were trembling a little, not from fear this time, but from release. For 3 years, I had carried their needs on my back, convinced it was my duty. But this small act felt like exhaling after holding my breath for too long. Still, doubt lingered at the edges of that relief. I stared at the calendar on the wall. December 26th. The holidays were supposed to be about family, not separation. Was I doing the right thing? Would David understand? Would the children suffer because of this? I rubbed my forehead and whispered, "Am I a bad mother for wanting peace?" The words hung in the air unanswered. To distract myself, I started cleaning the small stack of paperwork on my kitchen counter. Old statements, letters, tax forms, the clutter of a retired life that had quietly collected in piles. That's when I found a file folder marked 2023 Taxes. Inside was a printed email from Emily sent to me the previous spring. "Just forwarding your tax return, Margaret," the message said. I remembered glancing at it back then and trusting her completely. She'd offered to help me file online. I had been grateful. But now something made me look closer. The attached PDF was neatly formatted with my name and address. My eyes scanned down the form, and there it was, under dependents. 2 names, David Collins and Emily Collins. My stomach dropped. I had never claimed either of them as dependents in my life. That was something only they would gain from not me. My hands tightened around the paper. She had used my name, my social security number, my status as a retiree to lower their taxes, without telling me. It wasn't just the forgery anymore. It was the pattern, the quiet, practiced way she had woven me into their finances without my consent, the way she'd blurred the lines between generosity and exploitation until I could no longer tell the difference. I printed the document and laid it flat on the table. Then I went back to my email, searching for anything else she might have sent that I'd ignored. There were several similar attachments, forms, updates, requests for signatures. The deeper I looked, The clearer it became, Emily had been managing my information as if it were hers. I felt a strange calm settle in. Not the calm of peace, but of certainty. I gathered the papers and placed them neatly into a folder. Then I found a small storage box in the closet, one I used to keep photographs in, and slid the folder inside. I wrote on the cover with a black marker, "Evidence, December 2024. My handwriting shook slightly, but the words looked solid, real. As I locked the box and set it on the shelf, I caught sight of the window. Outside, the sky had turned white with snow. The first flakes were drifting down, soft and slow, covering the street, the trees, the world beyond my quiet house. I stood there watching, feeling both heavier and lighter at the same time. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Actions have a way of echoing, and mine had just begun to make sound. I touched the box one more time, almost like a promise. "This might matter later," I whispered. Then I turned off the light, and in the hush that followed, I could hear the snow begin to fall. By morning, the world outside had turned white and still, the kind of soft January silence that makes everything seem innocent again. I stood by the kitchen window watching the flakes drift down my breath, fogging the glass. I made coffee and told myself it was a new year, a clean start. For once, I had done something just for myself, and I wanted to hold on to that quiet sense of resolve. The house phone rang just as I sat down at the table. I almost didn't answer. The sound felt too sharp for the calm morning, but something told me I already knew who it was. "Margaret." Emily's voice burst through the line before I could even say hello. It was high, fast, frantic. "What did you do? What did you do to our insurance?" I blinked, startled but steady. "Good morning, Emily," I said softly. "Don't good morning me," she snapped. "I just got off the phone with the pediatrician's office. Our coverage is gone. The kid's appointment tomorrow has been canceled. The pharmacy says our plan doesn't exist." "What did you do?" I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "I removed you from my plan," I said. "Effective January 1st. There was silence, but not the peaceful kind. Then her voice came back, sharp as glass. "You did what? Why on earth would you do that?" "Because you're adults now," I said evenly. "You and David can get your own insurance." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're punishing us for a pair of socks. That's petty, Margaret. Beyond petty." I closed my eyes for a moment, keeping my tone calm. "No, Emily. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just done paying for grown adults who forgot to say thank you." I could almost hear her mouth opening and closing on the other end of the line. "You're unbelievable," she hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done to us?" "Yes," I said quietly. "For once I do." And before she could speak again, I ended the call. For a few minutes, I just sat there, the silence ringing in my ears. The coffee had gone cold again. My hands were steady, though, steadier than they'd been in months. I thought maybe that was the end of it. But I should have known better. An hour later, the phone rang again. David's name flashed on the screen. My heart gave a small, sad flutter. I picked up. "Mom," he began, his voice tight, like he'd been pacing. "Mom, what's going on?" "Emily's parents are here and they're laughing about this, about you canceling the insurance. Do you know how that makes us look?" I sighed. "David, I didn't do this to embarrass anyone. I did it because it's time you and Emily stood on your own feet." He sounded almost hurt. "You hurt your own grandkids, Mom. You embarrassed us. You made us look cheap." That word stung, not because of what it meant, but because of how easily he said it. "David," I said slowly, "I paid over $30,000 in premiums for your family over the last 3 years. Did you ever once ask if I was okay, if I could afford it?" Did you ever say thank you? The line went silent. I could hear him breathing, the sound uneven, heavy. Finally, he said, I didn't know you felt this way. That's because you never asked, I said, softly. And then, faintly, I heard Emily in the background, her voice sharp and close. Give me the phone! There was a scuffle, and suddenly her voice filled my ear again. You'll regret this, Margaret, she said coldly. Everyone will know what kind of mother-in-law you really are. You think people won't talk? I'll make sure they do. Goodbye, Emily, I said, and I hung up. Afterward, I just sat there again staring at the quiet kitchen. The light had shifted. The snow outside had stopped falling. The house felt too large, the air too thin. It's a strange thing the moment you realize your child is standing on the other side of a line you never meant to draw. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad anymore. I just felt empty, like a room after a storm. Everything still standing, but changed. I washed my coffee cup, dried it carefully, and set it on the rack. I told myself to breathe, to focus on small things. The hum of the refrigerator, the smell of detergent, the sound of the furnace kicking on. But my thoughts wouldn't quiet. I kept seeing David as a little boy, standing in the kitchen of our old house, handing me a crayon drawing and saying, This is you, Mommy, with a crown. How easily love turns into obligation. How easily gratitude fades. The day stretched on in uneasy calm. Around 4 in the afternoon, I sat down at the laptop to check my email. A new message blinked at the top of the inbox. The subject line made my heart give a hard, slow thud. Complaint filed. Unauthorized insurance termination by Margaret Collins. For a moment, I just stared at it. Then I opened it and read the first line. Dear Mrs. Collins, this is to inform you that a formal complaint has been filed regarding the recent removal of dependents from your health insurance policy. I closed the laptop and pressed my hands together. The quiet I had worked so hard to create was gone, replaced by a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes before a storm. I didn't have to wait long to see what kind of storm it would be. By the next morning, the wind had already shifted, not outside my window, but in the invisible space of screens and whispers. When I woke, my phone was blinking with notifications. I rarely checked social media anymore, but something about the sheer number of alerts made me uneasy. I opened Facebook, and there it was. Emily's post sitting at the top of my feed, already shared 6 times. Her profile picture showed her smiling sweetly beside David and the children, all wrapped in matching scarves. The post began with the words, I never thought I'd have to write something like this. And from there it spiraled into a performance of heartbreak. She wrote, My mother-in-law canceled our health insurance without warning, leaving my children uninsured in the middle of winter. We trusted her. We loved her. But she chose cruelty over family. Please, if you're lucky enough to have a kind mother-in-law, tell her how much you appreciate her today. By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling. Below it were comments over 200 reactions, most of them sympathetic. That's awful. How could anyone do that to their grandkids? What kind of person plays with healthcare? One woman had even written, She must be mentally unstable. Poor Emily. I scrolled and scrolled, each line cutting deeper. My throat felt tight. My coffee went cold beside me again. I wanted to defend myself, to say, You don't know what she did. You don't know the whole story, but I didn't. Because I knew how it would look, an older woman arguing online with her daughter-in-law would only make me seem bitter, defensive, guilty. By noon, my phone had stopped ringing with notifications but started ringing with silence instead. My neighbor Joyce usually called on Tuesdays to check in about grocery runs. She didn't call. The church group chat had gone quiet too. And then around 2 o'clock, I got a text from Linda, a friend of 20 years. Margaret, I don't know what happened, but this isn't like you. Are you okay? I stared at her message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. There were so many ways I could answer. It's not what you think. She lied. I was tired of being used, but I typed nothing. Because I knew that once you start defending yourself against a lie, you give it power. That evening, I made myself a bowl of soup, but couldn't taste a thing. I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the comments again. Some were cruel, others simply smug. She probably did it for revenge, one said. That line stopped me cold. Revenge. The word rolled around in my mind, heavy and ugly, but strangely clarifying. They didn't know the truth, and they didn't care to. People don't look for truth in stories like this. They look for villains. And once they decide who that is, nothing you say will change it. I realized then that I didn't owe anyone an explanation. Not Emily, not the neighbors, not Facebook. That thought steadied me more than I expected. I closed the app, turned off my phone, and looked around my quiet kitchen. The world outside had turned gray, the last light of day slipping behind the snowbanks. I felt hollow, yes, but inside that hollow space, something stronger was beginning to take shape. Something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. If they wanted to paint me as cruel, let them. I knew what I had done, and more importantly, why. But I also knew Emily, her love for drama, her ability to twist small truths into public performances. She was capable of more than gossip, and I couldn't afford to be naive anymore. So I went to my computer and typed lawyers near me family insurance disputes. After a few minutes of scrolling, one name caught my eye: Harris & Associates, Elder Law and Family Disputes. Their website looked straightforward, professional. The reviews called them firm but fair. That sounded like what I needed. I clicked the contact form and filled it out. Consultation requested. Margaret Collins. I wrote briefly about my situation. Insurance plan removal, family conflict, potential defamation. My hand hesitated over the submit button, but only for a second. Then I pressed it. A small message popped up. Thank you. Your consultation has been scheduled for January 3rd at 11 a.m. I stared at it for a long time, my reflection faint in the screen, older, tired, but no longer powerless. Later that night, I brushed my teeth, washed my face, and slipped into bed. The snow had started again, faint against the window, like whispers I couldn't quite hear. I reached for my phone to set the alarm. One new message blinked at the top of the screen, an unknown number. I opened it. The words were simple, stark, and cold. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. I stared at them until the screen dimmed my pulse, drumming softly in my ears. The quiet of the room no longer felt safe. It felt like the storm had finally found its way inside. I didn't sleep much that night. The message kept replaying in my mind, those 7 words glowing in the dark. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. I turned the phone face down on the nightstand, but the weight of it stayed heavy in my chest. By the time dawn crept through the curtains, I'd already made up my mind. Fear wasn't going to run my life anymore. I got dressed carefully that morning, choosing my navy wool coat, the one I'd worn to the hospital on my last day of work. It always made me feel composed, capable. I packed the folder of documents into my purse, the insurance forms, the tax file Emily had sent, and the printouts I'd made of her posts. My hands were shaking, but my steps were steady. At 10:45, I locked the front door behind me and drove into town through the pale winter light. The office of Harris & Associates sat on the 2nd floor of an old brick building downtown. The sign outside was simple professional elder law, family disputes, estate protection. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. I told the receptionist my name, and she gave me a kind smile, the sort people save for nervous clients. "Mr. Harris will be with you shortly, Mrs. Collins." A few minutes later, a tall man with silver hair appeared in the doorway. His handshake was firm, his eyes clear and calm behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Collins," he said warmly, "I'm Thomas Harris. Please come in." His office was lined with books, the kind with leather spines and gold lettering. He gestured for me to sit, then settled behind his desk with a legal pad and fountain pen. "Now," he said gently, "why don't you tell me everything from the beginning?" And I did. I told him about the health insurance, about paying for 3 years without help, about Emily's forged signature, the social media post, and the threatening message. I spoke slowly at first, then faster, as if the words had been waiting for someone to listen without judgment. Harris didn't interrupt. He nodded occasionally, writing in small, precise strokes. When I finished, the room felt lighter somehow, as if I'd set something down. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "you have zero legal obligation to maintain insurance for your adult son or his family. The complaint Emily filed is baseless." In fact, he leaned back slightly. "What she did by signing your name on that renewal form is a serious issue. That's insurance fraud." The words sank in slowly. Insurance fraud. It sounded so formal, so far removed from the messy reality of family, but the truth of it was plain. "I didn't want it to come to this," I said quietly. "I know," he replied. "But sometimes standing up for yourself looks like drawing a hard line." I handed him the tax file next. He slipped on his glasses again and scanned the pages. His expression changed almost immediately, his brow furrowing. His pen stilled. "Mrs. Collins," he said, tapping a line on the document. "Did you authorize your daughter-in-law to prepare this return for you?" "No," I said. "She offered to help. I thought she just filed it online for me." He looked up, his eyes sharp now. "This is serious. If Emily used your information to claim false dependents, that's federal tax fraud. We'll need to verify this with the IRS and your tax preparer. Do you still have copies of your original filings?" "Yes," I said, my voice faint. "In a box at home." "Good. Keep everything. Don't delete a single email and don't respond to anything they post online. Let me handle this." For the first time in days, I felt something close to relief. Not happiness, just the feeling of being believed, of not being crazy for seeing what was right in front of me. "Thank you," I said. I wasn't sure anyone would understand. Mr. Harris smiled gently. "Mrs. Collins, I've been doing this for 40 years. You'd be amazed how often the people who try hardest to keep families together end up being the ones everyone turns on." He set down his pen. "But the law is on your side here. They crossed the line. Not you." I nodded, trying to take in the weight of his words. "So what happens next? I'll contact the insurance company to confirm the cancellation was legitimate and properly documented. Then we'll address the complaint formally. If your daughter-in-law continues to make defamatory statements online, we can take action for that as well." He paused, his gaze steady. "As for the tax issue, once we verify it, we may need to report it. But let's take one step at a time." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "If we report it, what happens to them?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the folder carefully, aligning the edges. "That depends on what the IRS finds," he said finally. "But if the documents you've shown me are accurate, they could be in serious trouble." A chill ran through me, not of fear, but of realization. I had come here hoping for defense, but what I'd brought with me might become something much bigger, a weapon I hadn't meant to hold. Mr. Harris stood smoothing his jacket. "Mrs. Collins," he said quietly, "you did the right thing. Now go home. Try to rest. I'll call you once I've spoken to the insurance company." He walked me to the door, then stopped, his tone shifting slightly, becoming almost formal. "One more thing," he said, meeting my eyes. "Don't underestimate what people will do when they feel their comfort slipping away. Keep your phone on, and if anyone tries to contact you directly, don't engage. Call me first." I nodded my hand on the doorknob. "I understand." He gave a small, approving nod. "Good." Then with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he added, "Mrs. Collins, you might not be the one in trouble here. They might be." Those were the last words Mr. Harris said to me before I left his office, and they echoed in my mind for days afterward. It was strange how calm he had sounded, how certain, as if he'd seen this story unfold 100 times before. I, on the other hand, felt like I was standing on a frozen lake, hearing the faint crack of ice beneath my feet, not sure which step would send me plunging through. The next 2 weeks moved both quickly and slowly, the way time does when you're waiting for something you can't quite define. Mr. Harris took over completely. He contacted the insurance company first, then the IRS. I stayed home mostly quiet, trying to keep my routine coffee at 7, feeding the birds at 8 a walk around the block, if the snow wasn't too thick. Every day around 4, the phone would ring, and his calm, measured voice would update me on what he'd found. "Mrs. Collins," he said one afternoon, "we've received copies of the forms your daughter-in-law submitted to the insurance company. Would you be available to review them tomorrow?" I said yes, though. My stomach tightened at the thought. The next morning, an envelope arrived by courier, thick official, the kind that makes your heart beat faster before you even open it. Inside were photocopies of 5 documents, each stamped with company letterhead renewal forms, beneficiary updates, tax filings. I spread them out on the kitchen table, the papers crisp and cold beneath my fingers. And there it was, over and over, my name, my signature. Only it wasn't mine. I traced the loops of the M, the awkward slant of the G. Whoever had done it had tried to mimic my handwriting, but missed something subtle. The even pressure I'd learned from years of filling out patient charts, the neatness of someone who'd once prided herself on getting every detail right. These signatures looked hurried, uneven. They looked like someone pretending to be careful. I felt something deep inside me twist. Emily hadn't just taken advantage of my generosity. She had impersonated me 5 separate times over 3 years. 5 acts of deception, each one sitting quietly in a file somewhere, while I baked pies for her and called her family. By late afternoon, Mr. Harris called again. "I've reviewed all the documents with the insurance company and confirmed the forgeries," he said. "We've also shared them with the IRS for verification. It appears your daughter-in-law signed your name at least 5 times on policy renewals, tax documents, and even a form changing a beneficiary." Beneficiary, I repeated the word catching in my throat. "Yes," he said. "It seems she changed the secondary beneficiary on your life insurance from your son to herself." For a moment, all I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sank into a chair. "I can't believe it," I said softly. "I can," Mr. Harris replied gently. "I've seen this before. Trust is a dangerous currency, Mrs. Collins. People spend it freely until there's nothing left." The next day, his tone was different, graver. "I've been contacted by Emily's attorney," he said over the phone. "They're preparing a lawsuit against you for elder abuse by financial neglect." The words barely made sense. "Elder abuse? I'm the elder." I said, my voice breaking into a bitter laugh. I know, he said, calm as ever. It's a tactic. They're arguing that by removing the family from your insurance plan, you put the grandchildren at risk, thereby committing financial neglect. I pressed a hand to my forehead. This is madness. Can't we just stop? I don't want this to go on forever. I only wanted peace. On the other end of the line, Mr. Harris sighed, and for the first time his voice carried something like weariness. Mrs. Collins, if you withdraw now, they'll win. They'll walk away with no consequences and a story that paints you as cruel and unstable. And they'll do it again to someone else someday. Sometimes justice has to be fought for even when peace seems easier. His words stayed with me long after we hung up. I walked to the window looking out at the street below. The snow was melting, leaving patches of dull gray slush. Across the road, a neighbor I'd known for 10 years was shoveling her driveway. She didn't wave. Maybe she'd read Emily's posts. Maybe she'd made up her mind already. I turned back to the table and looked at the papers again, the fake signatures lined up like ghosts of a woman I didn't recognize. I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about truth, about reclaiming the right to my own name. For the first time, the fear began to shift into something else, something steadier. By early evening, I'd gone through all the documents marking each forgery in red ink, as Mr. Harris had instructed. My living room was scattered with evidence pages, sticky notes, folders. The sight of it was overwhelming, but strangely empowering. This was my story now, not the one Emily had told online. The light outside was fading when I heard it, the low hum of a car pulling up to the curb. I looked through the window and froze. It was David's car. The engine idled for a moment before turning off. I could see him sitting there, his head bowed, hands gripping the steering wheel. Then he stepped out, closing the door quietly, his face drawn and tired. He looked older, as if the past weeks had aged him years. I stood still by the window, my heart beating slow and heavy. He hesitated by the mailbox, glancing up toward the house, then started walking up the path. I didn't move. Not yet. I just watched him come closer, knowing that whatever he was about to say could change everything. The crunch of gravel under his shoes grew louder and then stopped. A moment later, there was a soft knock at the door, hesitant, almost apologetic. I opened it before he could knock again. David stood there, shoulders hunched, eyes tired. The cold air clung to him, carrying the smell of exhaust and snow. For a moment, we just looked at each other. I could see the boy he used to be, the one who once brought me flowers from the yard and said they were for no reason, just because. But that boy was gone now, replaced by a man caught between loyalty and guilt. "Hi, Mom," he said finally, his voice low. "Hi, David," I said. "Come in." He stepped inside, wiping his shoes on the mat. I led him to the kitchen where the table was still scattered with folders and papers. He looked at them but said nothing. I poured him some coffee. He didn't touch it. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, full of all the things we hadn't said in years. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Emily wants to drop the complaint," he said, eyes fixed on his hands. "She said she overreacted." I studied him carefully. "And you," I asked, "what do you want?" He hesitated. "I want things to go back to normal," he said quietly. A laugh slipped out before I could stop it. Not cruel, just tired. Normal. "You mean the kind of normal where I pay every bill and everyone pretends I don't exist?" He flinched, but didn't look up. "That's not fair, Mom." "Isn't it?" I asked. "For 3 years I covered your family's insurance, $800 a month every month. Did you ever once ask if I was okay? If I could afford it?" His voice cracked. I didn't know it was that bad. I thought you were happy to help. David, I said softly, did you ever ask? He finally met my eyes. His were red, wet at the corners. No, he whispered. No, I didn't. I sat back watching him. He looked smaller than I remembered, weighed down by something he didn't know how to carry. I wanted to reach out to put a hand on his shoulder like I used to when he scraped his knee. But that kind of comfort didn't fit between us anymore. Too much had been said and left unsaid. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. Emily thought you were trying to punish her, he said. She told me you were angry about Christmas about the socks. I shook my head slowly. It was never about the socks, David. It was about respect. About being seen. He nodded, silent again. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. When he finally stood, I thought that was it, that he'd say goodbye and leave. But he lingered by the door, his hand on the knob. There's something else, he said quietly. What is it? He took a deep breath. Emily said if you don't drop this, she'll prove you're an unfit grandmother. She says she has evidence. I frowned. Evidence, she said you were unstable, that you're... He stopped looking pained. That you're forgetful. That you might not be able to manage your own finances anymore. I stared at him. She's going to claim elder incompetence. He nodded miserably. She said she'd bring in people from the church neighbors, even family friends. People who think you've been acting strange. Something inside me went very still. For weeks, I'd felt the sting of whispers, the shift in people's gazes. Now it made sense. Emily had been preparing the stage all along. Tell Emily, I said, my voice calm but cold, that I'll see her in court. He blinked, startled. Mom, please, I'm just trying to keep this from getting worse. It's already worse, David. I didn't start this, but I'm not running from it either. He looked down, nodding slowly. I know, he said. I wish it didn't have to be like this. So do I said softly. But wishing doesn't make wrong things right. He lingered another moment, then turned the doorknob and stepped outside. The cold rushed in behind him, sharp and clean. I watched him walk back to the car, his breath forming small clouds in the air. For a second, I thought he might look back. He didn't. I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The kitchen felt emptier than before, as if his leaving had taken something more than just space. I went to the table and began gathering the papers, sliding them back into their folders. My hands were steady again. I'd made my choice. When the laptop chimed, I almost ignored it, assuming it was another notification from the lawyer. But the subject line made me stop cold. Notice of lawsuit, grandparent alienation, and financial elder abuse. For a long time, I just stared at the screen. Then I sat down slowly, feeling the weight of what that meant. The fight I thought might end today had only just begun. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the glow of the computer screen painting the walls in pale blue light, reading the lawsuit over and over again until the words started to blur. Each line felt like a knife carefully aimed to wound, not to kill, but to humiliate. The complaint opened with a single cold sentence: Margaret Collins, age 64, intentionally and maliciously used financial control to retaliate against her son's family, resulting in emotional distress and harm to her grandchildren. I read it again, slower this time, as if understanding it differently might make it less cruel. My name sat there like a stranger's. It went on. By unilaterally removing health coverage, Mrs. Collins endangered the well-being of minors and isolated them from their extended family, in a pattern consistent with grandparent alienation. Alienation, abuse, retaliation. Words I never thought would be attached to me. Attached to her. Emily. The packet included exhibits printouts of screenshots and photographs. One was of Lily's birthday party in November. Balloons, candles, smiling faces, and a caption, "Wish Grandma could have been here, but she didn't want to come." My throat tightened. I hadn't been invited. Another page showed a short text exchange. "Emily, can we talk, Margaret? Busy right now." Beneath it, Emily's lawyer had written, "Evidence of emotional distance and hostility." I turned another page. There were statements from her parents. The Millers, Margaret has always been distant and disapproving. She resents Emily's family and rarely participates in family gatherings. My hands shook as I put the papers down. I felt sick. How do you defend yourself against half-truths and twisted kindness, against smiles turned into daggers? The next morning, I called Mr. Harris. I got the documents. I said my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. "You need to see this." "Bring them in," he said. "And Mrs. Collins, don't worry yet. Let me read before you panic." I drove to his office with the packet on the seat beside me, tied neatly with a rubber band. The sky was gray, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that always comes before bad weather. When I walked in, he was already waiting, reading glasses perched low on his nose. He flipped through the first few pages quickly, his pen tapping the desk lightly with each turn. After a few minutes, he looked up at me with a faint, knowing smile. "They're panicking," he said. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, waving the papers slightly, "is what we call DARVO. Deny, attack, reverse, victim and offender. It's a strategy people use when they're caught in wrongdoing. They deny what they did, attack the person who exposed them, and then claim they're the real victim." He set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Collins, you're not the one on trial here, even if they're pretending you are." His calm steadied me. "But what about the evidence?" I asked quietly. He smiled again, that dry, confident lawyer's smile. "We'll deal with it. Every photo they submitted. We'll show you weren't invited. Every text they cherry-picked. We'll provide the full threads. And the statements from the Millers. We'll remind the court that they benefit financially from Emily's success in this case." I felt a small, flickering sense of relief, but he wasn't finished. More importantly, he said, reaching into his briefcase, "We have something they don't." He laid a folder on the desk and opened it slowly. Inside were copies of documents I recognized: insurance statements, renewal forms, and payment receipts. Each page stamped with my name and the dates stretching back 3 years. 36 months of payments, he said, totaling $30,600, all from your account. I nodded silently. He flipped to another section. Here, he said, are the emails from the insurance provider confirming no contributions from Emily or David, not once. He turned the page again, revealing the forged forms, the crooked signatures, the tax filings with false dependents. And this, he said, tapping the page gently, is the part that's going to hurt them most. The IRS is already reviewing these documents. Once they verify the fraud, this whole narrative collapses. I stared at the folder, feeling both vindicated and uneasy. I never wanted this, I said. I just wanted them to stop taking advantage of me. Mr. Harris nodded. I know. But they didn't stop, did they? They escalated. And now they've forced us to show the truth. He stood and began gathering the papers into a neat pile. We'll file a formal counterclaim. Defamation, fraud, and emotional distress. They'll wish they'd left this alone. For the first time in weeks, I saw something in his eyes that looked like fire. Not anger exactly, but the kind of energy that comes from seeing justice within reach. He slid the last document into its folder and closed it carefully. "Mrs. Collins," he said quietly, "I need you to stay calm. The next few weeks will be loud, but the noise isn't truth, it's fear. Let them scream. We'll show the facts." I nodded, the words grounding me more than I expected. As I stood to leave, he added one more thing, his voice low and deliberate. "They just made their biggest mistake, Mrs. Collins." I turned to look at him. "Why's that?" He smiled thinly. "Because they opened Pandora's box, and they won't like what's inside." Those words from Mr. Harris echoed in my head as I walked into the courthouse 3 weeks later. The building smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, the kind of clean that never quite hides the years. My heels clicked softly on the tiled floor as I followed Mr. Harris down the hall toward courtroom 2B. My hands were cold even inside my gloves. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. Emily was already there, sitting beside her lawyer at the plaintiff's table. She wore a fitted black dress and a small silver cross at her neck, her hair pulled back neatly. It was a costume, and I could tell she'd chosen it carefully, the picture of modest grief. When she glanced at me, her eyes glistened, as if tears were waiting ready to fall on cue. David sat behind her. His shoulders slumped, looking everywhere but at me. The judge entered promptly at 9, a woman around my age, perhaps a few years older. Her hair was gray, tied in a low bun, her face calm but sharp. She struck the gavel once, and the murmur of the courtroom died instantly. "This is a civil matter between Emily Collins, the plaintiff, and Margaret Collins, the defendant," she began. "We'll proceed with opening statements." Emily's lawyer rose, first a man in a navy suit with a smooth, practiced voice. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a case about betrayal within a family. My client, Mrs. Emily Collins, trusted her mother-in-law to help her family during a difficult time. Instead, Mrs. Collins weaponized that trust to punish her daughter-in-law for personal grievances, withdrawing essential health coverage for 2 innocent children. This act was deliberate, vindictive, and caused significant emotional distress." He gestured toward the display screen where photographs appeared one by one, the grandchildren smiling, playing in the snow, blowing out birthday candles. "These are the children at the heart of this matter," he said. "They were left uninsured without medical access because of a grudge over a Christmas gift." A soft gasp rippled through the audience. I sat still, my hands clasped in my lap, eyes fixed on the table in front of me. I refused to give them what they wanted, a reaction. Then Emily took the stand. Her voice trembled perfectly as she began. "I never wanted any of this," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I just wanted Margaret to love us, to love her grandchildren. But she changed. After Christmas, she stopped calling, stopped visiting, and then, one day, we found out she'd canceled our insurance. Just like that. No warning, no conversation." Her lawyer handed her another tissue, a performance they'd practiced. "Mrs. Collins?" he asked softly. "Do you know why she did that?" Emily sniffled. "Because I gave her socks," she said, her voice breaking. "It sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's the truth." For a moment, the courtroom was silent, except for her quiet sobbing. I looked toward the judge. Her expression hadn't changed. Not pity, not anger, just observation. When it was our turn, Mr. Harris rose slowly, his papers neatly stacked. His voice, calm and steady, carried easily across the room. "Your Honor, what we have just heard is a story dramatic, emotional, and completely detached from the facts." He turned toward the screen where he projected a spreadsheet. "This," he said, pointing, "is reality. For 36 consecutive months, Mrs. Margaret Collins paid for her son's family's health insurance. The total amount, $30,600. Every cent from her personal bank account. He clicked again. Here are the emails between Emily Collins and my client. In this one, Mrs. Collins offers to pay half the monthly premium, a promise never fulfilled, not once in 3 years. He paused, letting the numbers linger on the screen. Then he picked up a set of documents from the table. Now, let's address the issue of trust, he continued. The plaintiff claims to be the victim of cruelty. In reality, she forged my client's signature 5 separate times on official insurance and tax documents. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Emily stiffened in her seat. Mr. Harris approached the bench and handed copies to the judge. These are authenticated documents from both the insurance company and the Internal Revenue Service. My client never authorized them, not once. Each bears a falsified signature, Mrs. Collins's name written in another hand. The judge studied the pages for several seconds. Mrs. Emily Collins, she said, finally looking up. Do you deny signing these documents? Emily hesitated, eyes darting to her lawyer. I might have signed a few forms, she stammered. I thought it was just administrative stuff. Margaret knew about it. Mr. Harris stepped forward. Your Honor, if that were true, there would be written consent as required by law. May I ask the plaintiff to produce any such consent? Emily's mouth opened, then closed. Her lawyer shuffled his papers. We don't have that at this time, he said quietly. The judge's face remained unreadable. Mrs. Collins, she said you understand forgery on insurance and tax documents is a federal offense. Emily's face flushed. I didn't mean, I just... Enough, the judge said firmly, tapping her pen once on the desk. This court has heard sufficient preliminary evidence for today, Mr. Harris nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. The judge turned toward both tables, her tone cool but decisive. This court will recess for 3 days. I'm referring this case to the district attorney for fraud investigation. The gavel struck once. The sound echoed through the courtroom final and sharp as breaking glass. Emily's head snapped up her face, pale. For the first time since this began, she had no performance left. She looked not at me but at the floor, as if realizing that the story she'd written was no longer hers to control. 3 days passed in a blur. I barely left the house. The snow that had blanketed everything during the trial began to melt into gray slush, leaving behind streets that looked tired and worn the way I felt inside. Each morning I woke expecting to feel something like relief, but instead there was only a quiet emptiness. Winning it turned out didn't feel much like victory. It just felt like the end of a long, bruising storm. On the 3rd morning, Mr. Harris called. The district attorney has formally referred the case to the IRS, he said. They're investigating Emily's use of your name and social security number. His voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of gravity. There's also been contact from her employer. That afternoon, the news spread faster than I could have imagined. Emily's company, a financial consulting firm, had issued a short public statement. Effective immediately, Emily Collins has been placed on leave pending internal review regarding matters under investigation by federal authorities. The company remains committed to ethical standards and client trust. I read the words twice, then once more, though they barely seemed real. The woman who had spent years painting me as selfish was now being described as a risk to integrity. I didn't know whether to feel vindicated or just sad. Maybe both. By evening, her Facebook post was gone. Not just edited, deleted entirely. The comments, the sympathy, the outrage, all of it vanished. In its place, a new wave of whispers began to ripple through the neighborhood. She faked her mother-in-law's signature for years, one of my neighbors told another outside the post office. Can you imagine? All that time she played the victim. Another said, poor Margaret. She must have felt so alone. I heard them when I went to pick up my mail. They didn't think I could hear, but I did, and I didn't say a word. That night, messages began to arrive. One from Linda, the friend who'd texted me weeks earlier. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I should have known better. You didn't deserve any of that." Another from a church acquaintance. "We were wrong to believe her. I hope you can forgive us." I read each one carefully, my eyes dry, my heart unmoved. Forgiveness wasn't the problem. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. So tired. All I could think was how much time I had spent defending myself in silence, and how many people had been willing to believe the worst. The next morning, I sat by the window with my coffee and watched the snow melt, drip from the eaves. The sky was a flat, dull blue. My phone rang, breaking the quiet. David's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but then I picked up. "Mom," he said. His voice was raw, shaky. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what Emily did. I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us thick as fog. Finally, I said softly, "David, you knew enough." He started to speak, but I cut him off, my tone steady. "You saw enough too. You just chose not to see." He didn't argue. I could hear him breathing the kind of uneven breathing that comes before tears. "I thought she was just trying to hold things together," he said. "I didn't realize." His voice broke. "I didn't realize she was hurting you like that." "I know," I said quietly. "But sometimes not realizing is just another way of refusing to look." There was nothing left to say. We sat in silence for a few seconds longer before I heard him whisper, "I'm sorry, Mom." I closed my eyes. "I know I said, but sorry doesn't change what's already done." He sighed a long, defeated sound. "Are you ever going to talk to us again?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe someday, but not now." He didn't answer. Then softly, "I love you." The words lingered in the air, fragile and unfinished. I didn't say them back. Not because I didn't mean them, but because they didn't feel enough. Love was supposed to protect, to see, to stand up. And in the silence that followed, I realized how much distance can live inside love when fear is allowed to grow. "Goodbye, David," I said finally, and ended the call. For a long moment, I sat there staring at the phone in my hand. Then I set it down and turned toward the window. Outside, the snow had finally melted away. The grass beneath was patchy pale green, the first sign of spring. A robin landed on the fence, its chest bright against the gray. The world was waking up again, but my heart wasn't ready to follow. I rested my forehead against the cool glass and whispered to the quiet room, "I won, didn't I?" No one answered. Outside the window, the wind carried the faint scent of thawing earth and new beginnings. But inside, the air was still heavy with something colder than winter. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting once again in that same courtroom. The same pale walls, the same polished wood that smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. It was the final hearing the day of the verdict. I wore my best gray suit, the one I had bought years ago for David's wedding. It still fit, though it hung a little looser now. Mr. Harris sat beside me, calm as always, a stack of files neatly arranged before him. Across the room, Emily sat with her lawyer. She looked smaller than she had before, her posture less certain. Her face was pale eyes swollen from sleeplessness. Even her clothes, still elegant, but less deliberate, suggested defeat. When the judge entered the room, fell into silence. She adjusted her glasses, glanced briefly at both tables, and began to read from the document before her. Her voice was even steady, every word cutting through the air with clarity. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, she said this court finds that Mrs. Margaret Collins is not guilty of any wrongdoing. She had every legal right to remove dependents from her insurance plan at her own discretion. The words hung in the air, and I felt a slow breath leave me one I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months. The judge continued her tone firm but neutral. Furthermore, the court acknowledges evidence of falsified documents submitted under Mrs. Collins's name. Those materials will be forwarded to federal authorities for fraud investigation. Emily's lawyer leaned in toward her, whispering something, but she just stared straight ahead. The judge looked down again. As for the plaintiff, Mrs. Emily Collins, the court imposes a civil fine of $15,000 and orders repayment of approximately $8,000 in tax benefits obtained through fraudulent filings. Additionally, Mrs. Collins is prohibited from engaging in any financial advisory or consulting work for a period of 3 years. The gavel struck once. The sound was softer this time, but final. I sat very still. Mr. Harris turned to me and gave a small nod. "It's done," he said quietly. But I didn't feel triumphant, not even relieved. What I felt was something slower, deeper, a tired kind of peace, the kind that comes only after too many sleepless nights. Justice had been served, but it hadn't healed anything. It couldn't. As we left the courtroom, I glanced back once. Emily was still sitting there motionless. David stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, though she didn't seem to notice. For a moment, I almost pitied her, the woman who had taken so much and now had nothing left to hide behind. But pity wasn't the right word. What I felt was closer to grief. Outside, the day was bright and cold. The sky had that sharp blue clarity that only early spring seems to hold. Reporters were waiting on the steps, but Mr. Harris steered me quietly to the side exit. "You don't owe anyone a story," he said. "Let the truth speak for itself." I nodded and thanked him. He offered a polite smile and a handshake before heading to his car. Then it was just me standing on the courthouse steps, watching the world go about its business. People passing by had no idea what had just ended inside, or maybe what had finally begun. On the drive home, I turned off the radio and let the silence fill the car. The road wound through familiar stretches of countryside, bare trees, melting snow, the first shy buds of spring along the ditches. About halfway home, I pulled over. On the side of the road, a young mother knelt in the grass laughing as her little boy chased a paper kite. His laughter rang through the air, bright and careless. She caught him in her arms, and for a moment the world felt softer. Watching them, something inside me cracked. The tears came quietly, not sharp or angry this time, but slow, like a river thawing after a long freeze. I wasn't crying for Emily or even for David. I was crying for what had been lost, for the years of giving, of believing that love was enough to keep a family whole. For the empty place in my heart where my grandchildren's voices used to echo. When I finally started the car again, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, brushing the fields with a pale gold light. I drove the rest of the way in silence, the world blurring softly around me. When I reached home, the driveway was quiet. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and pine. As I approached the porch, something white caught my eye, a plain envelope resting against the door. My name was written on it in David's handwriting. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Inside was a check for $2,400 and a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a hurry. 3 months of what you paid. I'm sorry. David. I stood there reading the words again and again. The check trembled slightly in my hand. For the first time in a long while, I couldn't tell whether what I felt was forgiveness or something far sadder. The evening wind picked up rustling the trees along the fence line. I looked out at the horizon, at the fading light stretching across the fields, and whispered into the stillness, maybe this is what justice really looks like, not victory, but the chance to let go. 3 months passed quietly after that day. The world had moved on, and so had I, though not in the way people might have imagined. My days settled into a calm rhythm: morning coffee by the kitchen window, yoga at the community center twice a week, a watercolor class on Thursdays. I even joined the library's reading group, though most of the time I listened more than I spoke. It wasn't loneliness that kept me quiet. It was the comfort of stillness, something I'd never really known before. Spring had deepened into early summer. The air smelled like lilacs and cut grass. My yard, once neglected, had begun to look cared for again. I planted small things, lavender, rosemary, daisies, simple flowers that didn't ask for much, just enough water and sunlight. I realized one morning that I'd gone nearly a week without thinking about the trial. That realization brought a strange kind of peace mixed with guilt, as if forgetting meant betraying the woman I'd been when it all began. David sent checks every month, each for $800, the same amount I used to pay for their insurance. The first one came with a short note for what I should have done sooner. The next, "I'm still sorry, Mom." After that, just his name. I deposited them but never replied. It wasn't punishment. It was distance. I wasn't ready to rebuild something that had been broken so quietly, so completely. The phone would buzz sometimes with his messages, small, hopeful attempts at conversation. "The kids miss you. How are you feeling? Can we talk soon?" I never answered. Not yet. Forgiveness. I'd learned wasn't a word you spoke once. It was something you grew into day by day. One Tuesday afternoon, my friend Nora stopped by. We'd known each other since nursing school, though life had taken us in different directions for a while. She looked the same as always: silver hair, bright lipstick, eyes full of mischief. She carried 2 cups of iced tea and a travel brochure. "I've got an idea," she said, setting everything down on the kitchen table. "Come with me to Colorado, a week in Estes Park. Fresh air, mountains, no responsibilities." "What do you say?" I laughed softly. "Me, on a vacation?" "Yes, you," she said, pointing at me with a grin. "You've spent your whole life taking care of other people, Margaret. Don't you think it's time to take care of yourself?" I hesitated. The thought of traveling felt foreign, almost indulgent. "I don't know," I said. "It's been a long time since I did something just for me." Nora smiled gently. "Then that's exactly why you should." After she left, I sat at the kitchen table long after the ice in my glass had melted. The brochure lay open in front of me, showing snow-capped peaks under a clear blue sky. The idea scared me more than it should have. Not the travel itself, but the act of choosing something that didn't revolve around anyone else's needs. That evening, I turned on my laptop and hovered over the airline's website. The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting. I wasn't sure if I was ready to say yes to something new, or if I was still clinging to what had already ended. Then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Collins, this is Emily. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm sorry, and I'm getting help." I stared at the words for a long time. It didn't feel like manipulation this time. The tone was quieter, stripped of performance. Maybe she was finally telling the truth. Maybe not. I'd spent so long doubting her that I didn't know what belief felt like anymore. For a moment, I thought about replying something small like, "I hope you find peace." But my fingers stayed still. Some things didn't need to be answered. Some endings spoke best through silence. That night, I sat in bed with my laptop open again. The glow of the screen filled the room as I entered my details, clicked confirm, and heard the soft chime of the ticket booking. 1 seat to Denver. Departure in 2 weeks. I looked out the window. The moon hung low over the yard, silver light touching the flowers by the fence. For the first time in a long while, I felt something stirring in me, a sense of quiet anticipation, fragile but real. I reached for my phone and opened a new message to David. The words came easily. "I'm going away for a while. Take care of yourself." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over send. Then I set the phone down unsent. Outside, a soft wind moved through the garden, carrying the scent of lavender. Somewhere deep inside me, I felt the smallest spark of freedom waiting patiently to grow. 2 weeks later, that spark became real as I stood in an airport terminal, suitcase in hand, watching planes taxi across the runway. It had been years since I'd flown anywhere. The last time was when David graduated college. I remember sitting between him and his father, both of them laughing about how I'd packed too much. Now it was just me and Nora, who stood beside me, chatting easily with a flight attendant as if she traveled the world every month. "Ready for adventure?" she asked as we found our seats. "Ready for something," I said, smiling faintly. Adventure might be too strong a word. The flight was smooth, the sky impossibly blue above the clouds. As we descended over Colorado, the mountains rose like something ancient and eternal, their peaks dusted with snow. It took my breath away. Nora reached across the aisle and squeezed my hand. "See, worth it already." We spent our first afternoon wandering through a small mountain town that looked like something out of a postcard. Wooden storefronts, a coffee shop that smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans, children running with scarves trailing behind them. The air was thinner here, cleaner somehow, as if every breath stripped away a little of the heaviness I'd been carrying. Each day unfolded softly without demands. Mornings began with quiet walks near the lake, the air so crisp it almost stung my lungs. We took slow hikes, stopping often to rest and look at the endless stretch of sky. In the evenings, we'd sit in tiny cafes, sipping coffee and watching strangers pass by. I laughed more than I expected to. Small laughs at first, at Nora's stories, at her habit of talking to every dog she met, but soon it came easier. Real laughter. The kind that shakes something loose inside you. One night, after a long day of walking, we sat by the lodge fireplace. The flames threw a warm, steady glow across the room. Nora was already asleep in the chair beside me, her book half open on her lap. I took out the small leather journal I'd brought, but hadn't yet written in. For a long time I stared at the blank page, unsure what to say. Then the words came slow and sure. Freedom isn't revenge. It's the space to breathe again. I wrote it twice, underlining it once. Then I closed the book and sat back, feeling the truth of it settle into me. I didn't need Emily to beg for forgiveness or David to pay me back every cent. I didn't need anyone to recognize what I'd endured. What I needed, what I had finally found, was space. Space to exist without apology. Space to be myself again. The next morning, while Nora browsed a local market, I stayed behind in the lodge cafe, watching snow melt drip from the roof. My phone buzzed a soft vibration against the wooden table. It was an email. The sender's name made my breath catch. David Collins. I hesitated before opening it. "Mom?" It began. "The kids keep asking about you. They miss you." I told them the truth, that Daddy and Emily did something wrong, and Grandma had to protect herself. "They understand now. They're not angry. They just miss you. So do I." I read it twice, then a third time. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. For so long, I'd wondered if he'd ever really see me, not just as his mother, but as a person flawed and human and trying her best. Now, for the first time, I felt like he did. I stepped outside, letting the cold air hit my face, tears cooling against my cheeks. The mountains loomed in the distance, steady and silent. I thought about all the years I'd spent building my life around others, my husband, my son, even Emily, and how little time I'd ever spent simply living for myself. It had taken a lifetime of giving a year of pain and one long journey to arrive at this quiet place of truth. When I went back inside, the fire was still burning. I sat down, pulled out my phone, and opened a new email. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I began to type. Tell them I love them and I'll see them soon. I looked at the words simple and clean like a deep breath. No speeches, no apologies, just love, steady, uncomplicated enough. I pressed send. As the message whooshed away, I set the phone aside and turned back toward the window. The sun had slipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Somewhere far away, my grandchildren were getting ready for bed. I pictured them laughing, brushing their teeth, asking when Grandma might visit. For the first time in a long while, I let myself believe that the answer could be soon. A month after returning from Colorado, I found myself in the kitchen arranging flowers, yellow tulips my favorite, into a glass vase. The morning light streamed through the curtains, soft and golden, and for the first time in years, my home felt like mine again. The quiet was different now. Not heavy, not empty, peaceful. Outside, the trees had burst into full bloom, the yard alive with color. It was the kind of morning that whispered of new beginnings. It was also my 65th birthday. I hadn't planned anything grand, just a small afternoon gathering with Nora and a few friends from my art class. We'd made a little tradition of meeting every week to paint mostly flowers, sometimes landscapes, and it felt good to have people in my life who knew me not as David's mom or the widow next door, but simply as Margaret. By 2:00, the house was warm with laughter and the smell of lemon cake. Nora had brought wine, insisting we celebrate like women who've survived something worth toasting. I laughed at that, even though her words struck something true. We had all survived something lost, changed the slow ache of time. 65 looks good on you, Nora said, clinking her glass against mine. It feels different, I admitted. Not old, just settled. She smiled. That's what peace feels like, honey. You just forgot what it was. We were mid-laugh when the doorbell rang. Everyone paused, curious. I wasn't expecting anyone else. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to the door. When I opened it, my breath caught. David stood there holding a cake covered in uneven frosting, and beside him, my 2 grandchildren, Lily and Jack. They both wore wide smiles, each holding one side of a large, colorful drawing. Across the top, written in big, careful letters, were the words, Grandma's house. Surprised Lily shouted. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The sight of them, these small faces I'd missed so much, hit me like a wave. Then I laughed through the tears already forming. Oh my goodness, I whispered, kneeling to hug them. They smelled of sugar and sunshine. You made this for me. Jack nodded proudly. Daddy helped with the letters. Behind them, David smiled nervously. Happy birthday, Mom. I stood still holding the drawing. Come in, I said softly. Come in before I start crying on the porch. They joined the party, and for a while the room filled with the sounds of something I hadn't heard in a long time, family. The kids chatted with Nora and my art friends as if they'd known them forever. David helped slice the cake, careful, almost shy in his movements. When most of the guests had left and the children were playing in the living room, David and I sat at the table together, two untouched cups of coffee between us. The quiet between us wasn't strained now, just tentative, like a bridge being rebuilt one plank at a time. Emily and I, he began, his voice low. We're living separately right now. I don't know if we'll make it work again. Maybe we will. Maybe we won't. He looked up at me, eyes tired but honest. But I know one thing: I don't want to lose my mother again. My throat tightened. For years I'd wanted to hear those words. David, I said gently, I never wanted to lose you, not for a moment. I reached across the table, resting my hand on his. But this time you have to find your own footing. You can't let anyone, me or anyone else, carry you through life. Not anymore. He nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around mine. I understand. The kids came running in, then breaking the moment. Lily climbed into my lap, handing me a piece of her cake, now missing most of the frosting. This one's for you, Grandma, she said solemnly. I took a bite, smiling through the sweetness. That night, after everyone left, and the house fell quiet again, I washed the last of the dishes and sat by the window with a cup of tea. The birthday cards were still scattered across the table, the children's drawing propped against a vase of tulips. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing softly in the dim light, and began to type. I used to think love meant never saying no, I wrote. Now I know love means knowing when to stop, when to protect yourself, when to let go, and sometimes when to try again. I read the words twice, then printed them and placed the page in a small wooden box on the shelf. Inside were two other things: a pair of gray socks still neatly folded, and the first check David had ever sent me after everything fell apart. I sealed the box and wrote on the label, with a steady hand, the year I chose myself. For a long time I just sat there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint chirp of crickets outside. The ache that had lived in my chest for so long had softened into something gentler: acceptance maybe, or forgiveness. Not the kind that erased the past, but the kind that made peace with it. My phone buzzed on the table, the sound pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from David. The kids want to come over for pancakes this weekend. Is that okay? I smiled, feeling the warmth spread slowly through me. My fingers hovered over the screen before I typed back, I'll set the table. I set the phone down, stood, and walked to the window. Outside, the garden had come fully alive: tulips, bright against the green, the air humming with bees. The light of early evening settled softly over everything. Spring had truly come this time, and for once I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything to bloom. I was already there. And that was the year I chose myself. The story of Margaret Collins, a woman who learned that love doesn't always mean sacrifice, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do for your family is to finally take care of yourself. Her journey reminds us that peace is not given, it's chosen. That forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can soften its edges. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear what part spoke to your heart the most. Was it the moment Margaret stood up for herself, the quiet forgiveness at the end, or maybe the realization that love with boundaries is still love? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them, and they truly mean a lot. If you enjoy stories like this, stories about family healing and second chances, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Every week, we bring you powerful new tales of resilience, redemption, and the kind of everyday courage that reminds us all how strong the human heart can be. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, it's never too late to choose peace.